You ever have that moment when someone crosses a line and you realize they have no idea who they're dealing with? That was me, sitting on my porch at my ranch, coffee in hand, when I noticed it. The bridge. My bridge. The one I'd spent months building, the one that connected my driveway to the main road, was gone. Torn down. Not just a little damage, but completely demolished, like someone had brought in a demolition crew. At first, I thought maybe it was a storm, or an accident, or some runaway machinery. But then I saw it. A small, familiar logo on the temporary fencing. HOA, the Homeowners Association. On my property. I blinked. HOA? Out here? I live miles from the nearest neighbor, and yet they thought it was okay to tear down my bridge without permission, notice, or a single word. I felt that initial mix of anger and disbelief, the kind that makes your brain spin in circles, and then, slowly, a grin spread across my face. Because they had no idea who I was. Nobody in that HOA knew that I wasn't just a ranch owner. I'm a federal judge. And not just that. I have federal protection over my property. Now, they were about to find out what that meant. It all started a few months ago when I bought the ranch. It was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of Washington, the politics, and the endless lawsuits. A place where I could disconnect and breathe. The ranch had a beautiful creek running through it, and I built that bridge myself. Every plank, every nail, every beam. It was mine. Crossing that bridge gave me a sense of freedom my courtroom could never offer. But apparently, freedom was something the HOA couldn't tolerate. They had been quietly expanding their jurisdiction, creating sneaky little rules about property lines, easements, and access, all under the guise of community standards. And when it came to my property, they didn't just overstep, they outright assumed they could dictate terms. They made one critical mistake. They didn't check whose land it actually was. Standing there, staring at the rubble of my bridge, I realized this was no ordinary property dispute. This was personal, and it was about to become very interesting. Because when bureaucrats think they can play judge, jury, and executioner without knowing the law, they're in for a surprise. This wasn't just about a bridge. It was about principle, respect, and making sure people understand the law applies to everyone, even HOA boards. By the time they realized who I was, the situation had already escalated far beyond anything they could imagine. The next morning, I drove up to the site. The smell of sawdust and splintered wood still lingered in the air, and the sound of the HOA creek rushing underneath the destroyed bridge made the scene almost surreal. It was like nature itself was mocking them, whispering, "You shouldn't have done this." I walked around the perimeter, taking pictures for documentation. The HOA had left little clues of their handiwork, tire tracks from heavy machinery, hastily hammered stakes in the ground, even a small handwritten sign that read, "Authorized by HOA Board." Authorized? On my land? It was laughable. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't storm into the HOA office. I did something far more satisfying. I smiled and started planning. You see, when you're a federal judge, people tend to assume you're all about courtroom drama, suits, and legislation. But in situations like this, patience is a weapon. The HOA had just walked into a chess game they didn't even know they were playing, and I was already 10 moves ahead. Over the next few days, I watched them. The board members drove past my property like mice testing the waters. They weren't expecting a fight. They thought their little demolition stunt would intimidate me. They were wrong. Dead wrong. I began documenting everything. Their vehicles, their schedules, the specific equipment they used. every picture, every note, every timestamp was another piece of leverage. And trust me, leverage is everything when bureaucrats think they can bully someone. Then the calls started. One of the HOA members, let's call him Greg, called me directly. His voice was clipped, nervous. We didn't realize this bridge was private property. I interrupted, calm and deliberate. Greg, it's on my land. Federal land protections apply. You do realize that, right? There was a pause. I could hear him shuffling papers in the background, probably trying to find a loophole or some excuse. But there wasn't one. Not even close. You're a federal judge? He finally asked, almost whispering, like saying it out loud might make it untrue. Yes, I said. And yes, there are consequences for what your board just did. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to fix this without escalating the situation further. He hung up. And I knew right then the board was panicking. They had underestimated me. And that, my friends, is when the real fun begins. By the end of the week, I had prepared a detailed plan. Not just for rebuilding the bridge, but for sending a clear message. Nobody, not even a rogue HOA board, gets to destroy private property and think there won't be consequences. Fee Chirtui. Time they drove past my ranch, they didn't see a beaten man. They saw a calm, calculated storm. And storms, especially the ones that come from someone with authority and patience, tend to leave a lasting impression. Little did they know, the bridge was only the beginning. By the following week, the HOA board was in full-blown panic mode, though they were trying hard not to show it. I could see it in their emails, their hesitant visits, and the way they suddenly needed permission slips for every little thing, even things that had nothing to do with my property. They didn't know how to handle me, because I wasn't just angry. I was strategic, and when someone underestimates you, that's when you gain the upper hand. It started with small things. I made sure every interaction was documented. Every conversation, every phone call, every suspicious visit they made to the edge of my land, I recorded it. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about building a case they couldn't ignore. And as a federal judge, I knew exactly how evidence should be presented, how patterns of behavior could be framed, and most importantly, how intimidation could be turned back on the aggressors. Then came the next escalation. One afternoon, I spotted a group of their board members inspecting the creek near my destroyed bridge. They were whispering, pointing at the water, like it was theirs to command. That's when I decided it was time to remind them who they were dealing with. I called the local county authorities, not to report them immediately, but to make a subtle point. I made sure the sheriff knew that I was a federal judge and that there had been unauthorized destruction of private property on federal protected land. The message traveled faster than I expected. Within hours, I could practically feel the tension in their emails. But I didn't stop there. Oh no, I let them stew. I wanted to see how far they would push it, how greedy and arrogant bureaucrats could get when they thought someone would just roll over. And then came the most audacious move of all. One morning, I drove down to the remnants of my bridge and found a notice nailed to a tree, one of those official HOA notices. It claimed the bridge had been deemed unsafe and that it was mandated removal under HOA authority. I laughed out loud. Unsafe? I had built that bridge myself, inspected it daily, and reinforced it with steel beams hidden under oak planks. Unsafe. That was their attempt to cover up a mistake with lies. The beauty of it was, their notice now became part of the evidence. Every claim, every excuse, every overreach they made could now be traced back to them. And in court, or in negotiations, their credibility would vanish. By mid-afternoon, I had my team of investigators discreetly checking the exact boundaries of my property. Every inch of land that had federal protection was documented, mapped, and highlighted. By the time they realized the extent of what they had trespassed on, it would be too late. And that's when the twist hit them the hardest. They thought they were just dealing with a rancher, someone they could intimidate with fines and threats. But I wasn't just any rancher. I was a federal judge. I had authority, documentation, and legal protections they couldn't touch. I watched from the porch as they drove past my land again, their faces pale, their hands gripping the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. For the first time, the tables had turned. And I knew one thing for certain. The bridge was only the beginning. By the time this was over, the HOA would learn a very important lesson about boundaries, authority, and the cost of underestimating the wrong person. The next move had to be decisive. Watching them squirm from a distance was satisfying, sure, but patience had its limits. It was time to make them truly understand the consequences of trespassing on my property. I started by sending a certified letter to the HOA board. No threats, no tantrums, just facts. Detailed photos of the destroyed bridge, the equipment tracks, the notices they'd left behind, and a clear outline of federal protections over my land. I included citations from federal law, emphasizing that any further unauthorized entry would not only be trespassing, but a violation of statutes carrying serious penalties. Almost immediately, the board members went into overdrive. They called meetings, emailed frantic inquiries, and even tried to pressure neighbors to mediate the situation. None of it worked. Each time they reached out, I responded calmly, systematically, leaving no room for negotiation or manipulation. Then I decided it was time for the public eye to weigh in. I contacted the local news, not with a scandalous story, but a straightforward account of property rights, federal protection, and HOA overreach. Within a day, their phone lines were ringing off the hook, not with threats, but questions. Questions that made it painfully clear. The HOA had become the story, and the story wasn't in their favor. While all of this unfolded, I worked quietly on the bridge. Not only would I rebuild it, but I would do it in a way that left no doubt. This land was mine, federally protected, and not to be trifled with. Steel reinforcements, surveillance cameras hidden along the edges, and signs clearly marking federal property lines. The bridge would not just be functional, it would be a statement. And then came the kicker. One afternoon, I received a surprise visit from two of the board members who had been avoiding direct contact. They approached cautiously, hands raised, smiles forced. "Judge, we'd like to discuss the bridge," one of them stammered. I leaned on the railing, sipping my coffee, and smiled. "I'm listening." They tried the usual tricks, apologies, vague promises, insinuations that it had been a misunderstanding. But I wasn't buying it. I had the evidence, the legal precedent, and now the attention of the public. They weren't in control anymore. I was. I calmly explained that the only acceptable resolution was for them to acknowledge the trespass, cover the costs of damages, and commit in writing never to enter my land without explicit permission. No more games, no more overreach, no more assumptions. As they nodded, scribbling notes, I couldn't help but think about how ironic it was. The very people who had tried to exert power over me were now at my mercy. Not through intimidation, but through law, patience, and strategy. By the end of the day, the HOA board had been humbled. Their arrogance had met its match. And as I looked out over the creek, imagining the bridge finally restored, I realized something else. This was bigger than a bridge. This was about respect, authority, and making sure people understand that some lines, especially legal ones, should never be crossed. Little did they know, the bridge would be finished in a way that would forever remind them of the cost of underestimating a federal judge. By the time the HOA realized I wasn't bluffing, panic had fully set in. They began overreacting, making calls, sending letters, and even trying to bring in inspectors to my property without permission. Each move was more desperate than the last, and exactly what I had been waiting for. One afternoon, I spotted a group of them near the creek again, sneaking around the perimeter as if hoping to catch me off guard. But this time, I was ready. I calmly walked down to the edge of my property and waved at them. Their faces went pale. One of them stammered, Judge, we were just checking." "Checking what?" I asked, my tone deliberately slow and deliberate. "Your assumptions about power or your ability to break the law?" They had no answer, and that silence spoke volumes. I decided it was time to escalate, but not with anger. No, this was going to be a masterclass in subtle intimidation. I arranged for temporary cameras around the property, not hidden, deliberately visible. Each. One pointed directly at the bridge site, the creek, and any potential entry points. By the next day, the HOA's attempts to monitor my land completely stopped. They knew they were being watched, and that the federal protections over the property weren't just words. They were enforceable. Then I began the final stage of my plan. I rebuilt the bridge, but I did it differently this time. Reinforced steel beams, high-grade planks, and a small gate with a lock that could only be accessed by me. I installed signs. Federal protected property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Every nail, every plank, every sign was a reminder. This was my land, legally untouchable, and I was in complete control. But I didn't stop there. I knew the HOA still thought they could intimidate me indirectly, so I documented everything, including their previous destruction, their communications, and even the unauthorized inspectors they had tried to sneak onto my land. All of it was organized into a detailed report. A few days later, I sent them a copy. The letter was professional, concise, and devastating in its clarity. It outlined the damages, the illegal actions, and the potential consequences under federal law. No threats, just facts. And trust me, facts like these speak louder than words. Within hours, I started seeing results. Emails from the HOA board turned apologetic, hesitant, and, most importantly, conciliatory. They were finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. I had won the first battle. The bridge was restored, the trespassers humbled, and my property secure. But as anyone who's ever dealt with bureaucrats knows, this wasn't over. They would try again. They always do. But now, they knew they were dealing with someone who wasn't afraid to use every tool at their disposal. And I wasn't just going to rebuild a bridge. I was building a lesson they would never forget. A week later, the HOA's desperation had reached a fever pitch. They were sending emails, making calls, and even trying to involve local contractors to inspect my land. But everyone knew better. By now, word had spread quietly. This was federal protected property, and anyone attempting unauthorized access was taking a serious risk. One morning, I received a call from the HOA president, her voice trembling. "Judge, we want to make this right. Please, let's talk." I listened calmly, letting the weight of silence fill the room on my end. It was the kind of pause that made people fidget, overthink, and reveal more than they intended. "You've already done the right thing by stopping your destruction and acknowledging my property," I finally said. Anything else would be an escalation. I suggest you consider that carefully. That was the moment they realized they had no leverage left. Their authority, their board rules, even their community standards were meaningless here. I had rebuilt the bridge, reinforced it, and made sure that any attempt at interference would be visible, documented, and actionable. But I wasn't done. I wanted them to understand, once and for all, that underestimating me wasn't just a mistake. It was dangerous. I sent another report, this one even more detailed, outlining every instance of HOA trespassing, every unauthorized attempt to interfere, and the potential consequences under federal law. And then I took the step that finally shifted the balance completely. I filed formal notices with the county and federal authorities, documenting the entire saga. Now, any further attempt by the HOA to interfere would not just be foolish, it would be criminal. Then came the final twist. A few days later, the HOA president showed up in person, looking exhausted and anxious. "Judge, we're ready to comply," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly, letting her feel the full weight of the situation. Good. That's the only way forward. They had thought they could intimidate me, force me to bend to their will, and maybe even profit from their overreach. Instead, they had learned the hard way. I wasn't just a ranch owner. I was a federal judge. I understood the law, and I was prepared to enforce it without hesitation. As I watched them leave, shoulders slumped, I felt a mix of satisfaction and relief. The bridge was restored, my land secure, and the HOA humbled. But more than that, a key lesson had been etched into their minds. Never underestimate the person you think you can intimidate. And as I stepped onto my bridge, feeling the sturdy planks beneath my feet, I knew this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about boundaries, respect, and the consequences of arrogance. After the bridge was rebuilt and the HOA humbled, life on the ranch returned to a sense of normalcy. But I could still feel the ripples of what had just happened. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of one of their board members driving past, careful to stay on their side of the property line. They had learned, finally, that my land was not theirs to command. But there was a deeper satisfaction beyond just seeing them intimidated. It was knowing that law, patience, and strategy had won over arrogance and greed. People often think that force is the answer, that shouting louder or bulldozing over others will get results. The truth is, power isn't about noise. It's about control, planning, and understanding the rules better than anyone else. I began receiving calls and messages from neighbors who had witnessed the HOA's behavior over the months. They were stunned, partly by the audacity of the HOA, partly by how calmly I had handled it. Some confessed they had been scared of challenging the board themselves, worried about fines or retaliation. Now, they saw that even a single property owner, armed with knowledge, patience, and authority, could stand up and win. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled internally. Board meetings grew tense, and whispers about how we let this happen became the norm. Rumors circulated that the county was reviewing their conduct, and a few members quietly resigned. Their carefully curated image of control had unraveled completely. I, on the other hand, returned to my routine. Mornings on the porch with coffee, afternoons inspecting the ranch, evenings watching the creek flow beneath my reinforced bridge. The bridge had become more than a crossing. It was a symbol of boundaries, of resilience, of respect earned. Then came the unexpected twist. One evening, as I reviewed some federal property documents for my files, I realized there was one small loophole the HOA might try to exploit in the future. A clause buried deep in their charter about common land access that, if misinterpreted, could give them grounds for another encroachment attempt. I smiled. They thought they had seen the last of me, But the truth was, I had prepared for every eventuality. I drafted a clear, legally binding notice that preemptively addressed the clause, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Copies went to the board, the county, and even the local sheriff. Now, any attempt to claim access would be immediately nullified and fully documented for enforcement. For the first time, I leaned back and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. The HOA had learned their lesson. I had maintained control without raising my voice, without anger clouding my decisions. My property, my bridge, my land, all protected and secure. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the creek, I realized something else. This story wasn't just about a bridge. It was about respect. It was about authority. And, most importantly, it was about the subtle power of knowing your rights and enforcing them with precision. Just when I thought the saga was over, the HOA tried one last desperate move. A week after my preemptive notice was delivered, I spotted something strange while walking along the creek. A small truck, unmarked, parked near the property line. But this time, it wasn't just idle curiosity. They were measuring, taking photos, and trying to figure out a loophole in my defenses. I calmly watched from a distance. They had learned some lessons, sure, but desperation makes people reckless, and reckless people make mistakes. I approached, not with anger, but with authority. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady. The men froze. One of them stammered, we're, surveying?" "Surveying what?" I asked, stepping closer. "This is private land, federal protected land. Any unauthorized action here is considered trespassing and could lead to criminal charges." Their eyes widened. I could see the realization hitting them. Finally, the weight of their actions. I let the silence stretch for a moment, letting it sink in. Then I continued, "I suggest you pack up and leave immediately. Consider this your final warning. Any further attempts will be documented, reported, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." As they scrambled into the truck and drove off, I felt a rush of satisfaction. But I knew this wouldn't be the last time people underestimated others. That's why I had already reinforced the bridge with cameras, locks, and multiple warning signs. That night, I reviewed footage from the cameras. Sure enough, the truck had circled the property twice before retreating. Every second captured, every face documented. If they tried anything else, I had proof. And evidence like that in federal court is decisive. By the next morning, the HOA board was in complete disarray. Emails poured in from every member. Apologies, requests to meet, even attempts to negotiate terms. It was almost comical, the contrast between their arrogance before and their desperation now. I scheduled a formal meeting. Calm, precise, and professional, I laid out the consequences of any further overreach. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten. I simply presented the facts. Federal protections, documentation, legal precedent, and a clear outline of what would happen if they tried to interfere again. For the first time, I saw true humility on their faces. The arrogance, the audacity, the delusion, they were gone, replaced by caution, respect, and the dawning realization that underestimating someone with authority and preparation is a costly mistake. By the end of the day, the HOA had agreed to fully respect my property. No more unauthorized actions, no more letters, no more threats. The bridge was mine. The land was mine. And the lesson had been learned. And as I walked across the newly rebuilt bridge that evening, the water flowing steadily beneath, I realized this wasn't just a victory over a board of bureaucrats. It was a reminder that knowledge, patience, and strategy always triumph over arrogance and ignorance. The HOA had pushed their luck one too many times, and I had shown them exactly what happens when someone underestimates the wrong person. With the HOA fully subdued and their last attempt to meddle thwarted, Life at the ranch finally settled into a rhythm of peace. The bridge stood strong. The creek flowed steadily beneath it. And for the first time in months, I could breathe without watching over my shoulder. But the story didn't end there. Word of the HOA's misadventures spread quietly through the county. Local contractors, neighbors, and even other HOAs began hearing whispers about what had happened. The lesson was clear. You cannot bully or intimidate someone who knows their rights and is prepared to enforce them. Internally, the HOA board was fractured. Members argued over who had authorized the destruction of my bridge, who had failed to check property boundaries, and who had allowed their own arrogance to put them in legal jeopardy. A few quietly resigned, unwilling to deal with the scrutiny or potential liability. The board meetings became tense, awkward, and noticeably subdued. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring the property. Cameras recorded. Signs reminded trespassers that the land was federally protected, and my documentation ensured that if anyone tried to challenge me, I had irrefutable proof. The bridge was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of authority, vigilance, and respect for the law. One evening, as I watched the sun set over the creek, I reflected on the events. The HOA had thought they could intimidate me, bulldoze over my rights, and manipulate the system. Instead, they had been met with strategy, patience, and legal authority. Their arrogance had been their undoing. Neighbors, who had once been wary of HOA power, now saw that standing up to overreach was not only possible, but necessary. I received quiet messages of support from people who had witnessed the board's audacity, thanking me for showing that even a single property owner could prevail when armed with knowledge and patience. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't the victory itself. It was the lesson. People often underestimate what it means to know your rights and enforce them calmly, methodically, without emotion clouding judgment. That bridge, rebuilt stronger than before, wasn't just wood and steel. It was a testament to resilience and strategy. The HOA had learned their lesson, but the story left a lingering ripple across the community. The arrogance of thinking that rules could be twisted to suit one's desires had met its match, and anyone watching knew. Crossing the line on private property, especially federal protected land, carries consequences far beyond a simple apology. As night fell, the ranch settled into quiet serenity. The creek whispered beneath the bridge, a reminder that some boundaries are sacred, and some lessons, once taught, cannot be forgotten. Weeks passed, and the ranch returned to the quiet serenity I had always cherished. The bridge stood firm, the creek gurgled beneath it, and life moved at its own unhurried pace. The HOA, they were barely a whisper now, a cautionary tale more than an active threat. But the true satisfaction came one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills. I was inspecting the bridge, running my hands over the reinforced steel beams, when it hit me. This story wasn't just about me. It was about every property owner who had been bullied, underestimated, or ignored by bureaucracy. And, most importantly, it was about how consequences catch up to those who act recklessly. Then came the twist they never saw coming. Through careful monitoring and documentation, I realized that some board members had been quietly trying to rewrite history, claiming in private emails that they had acted with permission and that I had overreacted. So, I did something perfectly legal, yet perfectly satisfying. I compiled all their communications, the evidence of their trespasses, and the photographic proof of the bridge's destruction. I forwarded it to the HOA's insurance company, the county authorities, and the state oversight office. Every lie they had told, every claim they had made, now became the foundation for potential disciplinary action, not just against them personally, but against the HOA board as an organization. Within days, the board was being questioned officially. Their credibility evaporated faster than they could blink. The very arrogance that had led them to destroy my bridge had become their undoing. And the best part? I hadn't lifted a finger in anger. Every move had been deliberate, calm, and precise. Neighbors whispered, contractors shook their heads in disbelief, and the county quietly acknowledged the error of overreach. And me? I walked across my bridge, the water reflecting the golden sunset, knowing the lesson had been learned. Authority and preparation always outweigh arrogance and aggression. Finally, with the bridge fully restored, cameras in place, and every federal notice documented, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The HOA had pushed their luck one too many times. They had learned, the hard way, that some boundaries, especially when federal law is involved, are absolute. As the night fell over my ranch, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, I realized something profound. This bridge wasn't just wood and steel. It was a testament to patience, knowledge, and the quiet power of knowing your rights and enforcing them with precision. And somewhere, miles away, the humbled HOA board learned that crossing the wrong person can have consequences that linger far longer than anyone expects. The creek whispered beneath the bridge, carrying with it a simple truth: respect boundaries, or pay the price. That's all for today, folks. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.